Welcome to Mind Minutes, where we untangle those everyday mental knots. Today, we're diving into something super relatable, the desperate need to be, well, responded to, right?
Oh, tell me about it. That feeling of sending a text and then crickets, it can drive you insane.
Exactly, and this article we're discussing really nails it. It starts with this almost desperate plea from people saying, my partner never texts back, or I pour my heart out and they just ignore me. It's heartbreaking.
It is. And the article points out how this isn't just about being needy or clingy, it's about a fundamental human need, the need for closure.
Totally. It's like we need that response to feel like things are okay, like we're connected, you know? Like we matter.
Right. And the article uses this really interesting analogy with monkeys, how baby monkeys isolated from their mothers and peers become withdrawn and unable to form relationships. It emphasizes how crucial responsiveness is for our development and for forming connections.
Fascinating, yeah. And it goes beyond just monkeys. The article talks about this concept of cognitive closure, needing answers to reduce uncertainty. Think about it. You text your partner about weekend plans, no reply. You spend the whole day wondering.
Oh, I so get that. It eats away at you, right? That waiting, that not knowing. It steals your focus and messes with your emotions. And it goes even deeper than that, doesn't it? It touches on our sense of control, our security.
Absolutely. If someone consistently responds, it builds this sense of, okay, things are predictable. I have some influence here. But inconsistent responses, that throws you off balance. You start to question everything. You feel like you're losing control, which creates this underlying anxiety.
And that's where the self-doubt creeps in. You start thinking, is it me? Am I not worth responding to? It can be really damaging to your self-esteem.
Exactly, hit the nail on the head there. This seemingly small thing, this lack of a simple reply, can spiral into this huge self-worth issue. And the article even dives into the different types of responses and how even a haha or yeah can be better than nothing if it's genuine. It at least acknowledges the other person. But what really matters are those responses that are well thoughtful and meaningful. Those are the responses that really nurture a relationship, right?
Oh, for sure. It's not about demanding a reply to every single thing. It's about quality over quantity, you know? It's about recognizing what the other person needs in that moment. Sometimes it's practical help, sometimes it's emotional support, and sometimes it's just a simple acknowledgement that you've heard them.
And it's not just about romantic relationships, right? This need for responsiveness, this craving for connection, it's everywhere. Think about work emails, family group chats, even just casual friendships. Hmm.
Oh, absolutely. Waiting for a crucial email reply from a colleague can be just as agonizing as waiting for that text back. It's that same feeling of being left hanging, of not knowing where you stand. It's like, hello, I exist.
Exactly. And the article touches on that, how it impacts our sense of belonging, you know? Like, are we part of the team? Are we valued? It's tied to our fundamental need for social connection.
Yeah, and it can be even more complicated in group settings. Who's responsible for responding? Is it a silent agreement that everyone reads, but no one replies? It's a whole other level of communication chaos.
It is. It's like a weird social dance where everyone's trying to figure out the steps, but no one's leading. And then there's the whole issue of different communication styles.
Right? Some people are just naturally more responsive than others. So, how do you navigate those differences without assuming the worst, without immediately jumping to, they hate me or they're ignoring me on purpose?
Exactly. I mean, some people are super quick to reply, others take their time. Some are all about emojis, others prefer a simple K. And the article suggests that understanding those differences is key.
For sure. It's about recognizing that not every unanswered text is a personal attack. Sometimes life just gets in the way. People are busy, they get distracted, they forget.
Yeah, totally. But even understanding that, it can still be hard not to take it personally, especially when it becomes a pattern, right? Like if someone consistently leaves you hanging, it's natural to start questioning the relationship.
Oh, definitely. And the article goes into this how consistent unresponsiveness can erode trust and create distance. It's like death by a thousand unanswered texts. It chips away at the foundation of the relationship.
So it's like even if you understand that, life gets in the way, it's still tough when unanswered messages become a constant thing. It really makes you question the relationship. This study we're looking at, it really digs into that. It specifically looks at how this plays out in long distance relationships. Hmm.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Because long distance adds another layer of complexity, right? You're already relying so heavily on communication to stay connected.
Exactly. And this study, it uses both self-reported data and actual behavioral data. which is kind of cool. It's not just what people say they do, but what they actually do.
Oh, I see. So like tracking actual message response times and stuff?
Yeah, exactly. And they found some pretty fascinating stuff about how people adapt their communication styles in long distance relationships. Like they become more intentional, more strategic with their responses.
That makes sense. You have to be, right? Every interaction carries more weight.
Totally. And they talk about this idea of perceived partner responsiveness. Like it's not just about whether someone replies, but how you perceive that reply. Is it thoughtful? Is it meeting your needs in that moment? It's subjective.
Right, because a quick haha can feel supportive in some contexts, but totally dismissive in others.
Exactly. And the study digs into how these perceptions can really shape the relationship dynamics. Like, if you constantly feel like your partner isn't responsive, it can breed resentment and insecurity.
Oh, for sure. It can create this negative feedback loop. You feel ignored, so you become more demanding, which can then make the other person less likely to respond, you know?
Yeah, and they connect this back to the need for closure, for that feeling of certainty, like we talked about earlier. Kruglansky and Webster's work on this really comes into play here, that whole idea of seizing and freezing.
Right. That we crave certainty, so we latch on to explanations, even if they're not necessarily accurate, just to resolve that uncertainty.
Precisely. And in long distance, that uncertainty is amplified, so that need for closure becomes even stronger.
Makes sense. So you're more likely to jump to conclusions, to overthink things, because you're lacking that in person context.
Yeah, and the study found that people in long distance relationships actually engage in more adaptive communication behaviors. Like they might schedule specific times to talk, or they might send longer, more detailed messages to compensate for the lack of physical presence.
That's interesting. So they're actively working to bridge that distance, to create a sense of connection even when they're apart.
And it's not just about, feeling ignored. It's about it's about trust, right? Like the article mentions, consistent unresponsiveness, it really erodes trust, especially in long distance relationships.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If you can't rely on someone to even send a quick text back, how can you rely on them for the big stuff, right?
Exactly. It creates this like underlying sense of unease. Like, are they really there for me? Do they actually care?
And that's what the study really highlights, that perceived partner responsiveness. It's all about how we interpret those responses or the lack thereof.
Yeah, yeah. And that's subjective. A haha can be fine one day, but, totally dismissive the next, depending on the context.
For sure. And context is everything. The study talks about this, how a short reply might be okay if you're both super busy, but not so much if you're having a serious conversation.
Right. And they also looked at how people adapt, right? Like in long distance, people actually become more intentional with their communication. They schedule calls, write longer messages, they try to bridge the gap, so to speak.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Almost like they overcompensate for the lack of physical presence.
Exactly. It's like, I can't be there in person, so I'm going to make extra sure my messages convey how I feel, which I think speaks to that underlying need for connection we've been talking about.
Totally. And this idea of adaptive communication behaviors, it's fascinating. Like they're actively trying to create a sense of closeness even when they're miles apart.
Yeah. And it shows that responsiveness isn't just about replying, it's about showing up for the other person in a way that meets their needs in that moment.
And that's where the whole seizing and freezing thing comes in, right? From Kruglansky and Webster's research, that in long distance, that need for closure is amplified. So you claim to any explanation, even if it's not true, just to reduce that uncertainty.
Precisely. And that's where things can go south. You start overthinking, jumping to conclusions, you start questioning everything. It's like if they're not responding, it must mean they don't care.
Yeah. And then the article brings up Smith and Williams and that text messaging study. Wow, that study where they ostracized people using texts. Talk about a powerful way to demonstrate how much even a tiny little non-response can hurt.
It's brutal, right? Like being left on red or getting no reply, it triggers that same primal fear of exclusion that we talked about earlier with the monkeys. It's deep seated. Hmm.
Totally. It's like a digital version of social isolation. It taps into those same vulnerabilities, and it can be incredibly damaging to self-esteem.
So, this is really hitting on something fundamental, isn't it? That deep seated need we all have to feel seen, heard, responded to.
Yeah, it's like that Maya Angelou quote, right? People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And not responding, being left hanging, that sends a powerful message, even unintentionally. It makes people feel forgotten.
It's almost like a digital version of ostracism, isn't it? And that Smith and Williams study, the one where they ostracize people via text, it just drives home how painful that can be.
Oh, yeah. Brutal. Just goes to show even a small thing, like a non response, can be devastating. It triggers that same primal fear of exclusion, like we were talking about with the monkeys.
It's like our brains aren't wired to handle that kind of social disconnect. It throws us off balance, makes us question everything. Is it me? Am I not important enough? Hmm.
Yeah, it can really mess with your head. And it's not just romantic relationships either. Think about work, family, friends, that waiting game. It can be agonizing no matter the context.
Totally. And the thing is, it's not always about demanding constant attention, right? It's about quality over quantity. It's about knowing that someone is there for you, that they care enough to acknowledge you, to engage with you in a meaningful way.
Exactly. It's about feeling connected, feeling valued. And that goes beyond just responding, right? It's about how you respond. Is it thoughtful? Is it tailored to the situation? Is it genuine?
Right, because a quick haha can be fine in some situations, but in others it can feel dismissive. Context is everything. And this study we were discussing, the one on long distance relationships, it really highlights that.
Yeah, the whole perceived partner responsiveness thing. It's not just whether someone replies, but how you perceive that reply. And in long distance, where communication is so vital, that perception becomes even more loaded.
And that's where the whole seizing and freezing thing comes in, right? That need for closure becomes amplified because the uncertainty is higher. So we latch onto explanations, even if they're not accurate, just to ease that anxiety. We jump to conclusions. We overthink.
It's a vicious cycle. You feel ignored, so you become more demanding, which can then push the other person further away. And that's why those adaptive communication behaviors are so crucial in long distance. Scheduling calls, sending longer messages. It's about actively working to bridge the gap, to create a sense of closeness, even when you're miles apart.
Yeah, it's about showing up for the other person in a way that meets their needs in that moment. And it's not just about avoiding conflict. It's about building trust, about strengthening that connection. It's about making the other person feel like they matter, like they're not alone.
Absolutely. And on that note, we've reached the end of today's Mind Minutes. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We hope this has given you some food for thought about the power of responsiveness and the importance of those everyday connections. Until next time, take care and be well.